All organisms grow, develop, and reproduce. And in order to do so, they need a source of energy and a source of matter. Each organism's approach to this, however, is quite unique. This osprey, for example, uses its excellent eyesight to spot the sparkling sides of a fish in the water and snatch it out and bring it home to feed to its youngsters. Contrast that with the sun-soaked existence of kelp, the largest algae in the world that derives all its energy from sunlight, while absorbing the matter that it needs from the surrounding water column. Still more bizarre is the strategy that fungi take on. For example, these mushroom species that are living on these dead logs are secreting digestive enzymes onto the logs, breaking them down, and then they slurp up the digested food by absorption. It's almost the equivalent of you walking up to your breakfast, puking on it, watching it digest before your very eyes, and then drinking it down. One could spend a lifetime studying the bizarre habits that organisms have developed to obtain matter and energy, but one would also find over time that organisms can be divided into two basic categories, the autotrophs and the heterotrophs. Auto means self, as in an automatic automobile. An automobile can move itself, and an automatic automobile can switch gears on its own. Troph means feeding, so an autotroph can feed itself. In other words, it can capture the energy that it needs from sunlight and use it to make food by photosynthesis. On the other hand, we have the heterotrophs. Hetero means other, in the same way that heterosexuals are attracted to the other sex, and troph still means feeding. These organisms take matter and energy from other organisms and break them down by a process known as cellular respiration. Whether employing the autotrophic or the heterotrophic strategy, all organisms need this energy in order to do work. Now, when we think of work, we sometimes think of going to our job or studying a lot as a student. And indeed, such practices do require a lot of work. But when a biologist wants to understand work, they want to look at what are the cells inside an organism doing in order to allow that organism to study up well for a test or get their job done. So how specifically do our cells use energy? Well, if you were going to, say, move your arm, there are a bunch of different processes that need to take place for you to do that. For example, there might be some glycogen polymers that need to be broken down into their monomers so that the energy can be accessed, powering the movement. Your nerve cells need to send signals to your muscles telling them to contract, and they send those signals using these small particles that this nerve cell is currently moving across its membrane, and unless it moves the particles across the membrane, it's not going to be able to send the signal. So that's another kind of work your cells have to do. And then there's the grunt work, the actual movement of the muscle tissue, which is done by this motor protein right here called myosin, as it pulls on this long chain of actin protein. It grabs onto that and strokes this way, and when it does, that helps cause the muscle to contract. And for each of these to take place, that requires a kick of energy, represented by three mysterious letters that we will foreshadow now. Another way to understand our cells is to picture them as an arcade with many games in them, all of which need to run, particularly if you want to be a cool kid. There's a problem, though. You only got $20 in your pocket. And unfortunately, the arcade games don't accept 20s. So what are you going to do? You go over to the sweet token machine, you put in your $20, and then out comes a bunch of tokens. And tokens have just the right amount of value, and they're shaped just so to actually get the game to run. So the arcade is kind of like our cells that have a million games in them, all of which require a little something in order to get them to run. The $20 is kind of like glucose. That's the molecule that we take in as our original source of energy. But like the $20, glucose has too much energy in it, and it's not the right shape to actually activate anything inside our cells. So instead we have to take that glucose to the token dispensers, which in this case are called mitochondria. Singular mitochondrion, and then that mitochondrion takes the glucose and converts it into a much more useful molecule, the equivalent of the game token, which in our cells is called ATP. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is the perfect molecular game token because of its shape. It's got the adenosine, which is this portion of the molecule, and then on the end it's got these 3 phosphate groups. Your textbook compares an ATP molecule to a fully charged battery, and it's the job of the mitochondria to charge that battery, particularly if the battery has run out. Now, here's a related molecule, adenosine diphosphate. As you already know, di means 2, and so adenosine diphosphate is not quite as charged because it's missing a phosphate group. There's a phosphate group that hasn't been attached yet. So this represents a sort of used up version of ATP. But once you add a phosphate group to that ADP molecule, you make the fully charged, fully functional ATP molecule that cells actually use. Now, what about the molecular structure of ATP allows it to store energy? Well, if you look closely at these phosphate groups, if you draw it out in molecular diagram form, you can see that they all have negative charges. So like a negative charge here on this oxygen, and here on the end as well. And you guys know that negative charges don't feel so psyched about hanging out with each other. In fact, they repel. So if you take all these phosphate groups and you link them up, it's almost as if you were taking a spring and compressing it, squeezing it into one area, which means that at any moment, if you let go of that spring, zoom, it could expand, and a phosphate group could go shooting off of this ATP, and when it does so, that could give some chemical reaction the little molecular kick that it needs in order to take place. So you might picture your cells as filled with tons of little ATP springs that are used to do every bit of work in the cell. And those springs are used for basically every game in the arcade. And so I'll just take a moment to show you some detailed descriptions from a more advanced textbook on ways this energy can be used. Read them if they interest you, otherwise you can skip to the next portion of the video.